My basic motivation for being a libertarian has never been economic, but moral. While I was convinced that the free market was more efficient and would bring about a far more prosperous world than statism, my major concern was moral, the insight that coercion and aggression of one man over another was criminal and iniquitous and must be combated and abolished. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today I'm joined by Thomas E. Woods Jr., a PhD from Columbia, as well as Harvard. Mr. Woods, where is the best place to find your collection of ebooks and podcasts?
Well, I have considered having one site with all the ebooks on it, but apparently there's some marketing principle that says if you give people too many choices, they get overwhelmed and they don't choose anything. So you present the ebooks one at a time. So the one actually that I just did an episode of my own show about has to do with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is sort of the opposite of the kind of person we're going to be talking about today, just because I keep coming across people in the libertarian world who say she's the most libertarian member of Congress. And I think the state of libertarian education has probably been better. So I have been really pushing my AOC ebook, which is quite memorably called AOC is Wrong. And so I store that. It's available at aociswrong.com. And I know that the point of our interview is not to talk about my domain names, but I do want to say that fortune was smiling on me when I decided to buy aociswrong.com, because I bought that before people had started calling her AOC. She wasn't quite well known enough and didn't have the notoriety yet for there to be this three initial nickname. I chose it because her real name is too long for a domain name, I thought. So I just made it AOC, and then everyone started calling her AOC. This is unbelievable that I own aociswrong.com. So I would send people there. Get that.
Links to that will be in the description below. Tom, I want to talk about some of our heroes in the freedom movement. Please give me what you think is either this person's greatest contribution or one thing that you learned from them that really stands out. What is the greatest contribution or most important thing you learned from Hans-Hermann Hoppe?
All right. Well, first of all, let me ask, just so I can pace myself correctly, is this a lightning round with 50 names, or is it going to be like 4 names?
12 names.
12 names. All right. So
okay.
What would your ideal response time for each of these be?
3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes for each. All right. I'll keep an eye on the clock.
Okay.
All right. Well, Hans has become known in terms of his books for his book on democracy. And that is a book that really did kind of bring me fully over into the ANCAP world. But long before that book, I had read his books, The Economics and Ethics of Private Property and A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. And for me, it's not just one major contribution, it's a bunch of insights. So I think his critique of the public goods argument is very, very effective, that there are some goods that they're non-rivalrous and non-excludable, and they have to be provided for by government or they'll be underprovided on the market. And he just shows that the string of inconsistencies in that. So his book, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, has a great chapter on that. But there's a chapter in his book, The Economics and Ethics of Private Property, that to this day continues to blow my mind. And I am sorry, because of my advanced age, I don't remember the name of the chapter, but you'll know it when you see it. Because even though a book called The Economics and Ethics of Private Property sounds dull and boring, it is one of the most intellectually exciting books you will ever read. And he has a chapter in there in which he begins from primitive society using barter. And step by step, he gets you to a modern economy with a fiat money system. And he shows how you go from barter to commodity money, to commodity money with paper substitutes, and then to just the paper with no commodity backing. And then he shows where banking comes from, and he talks about, and from all this, he talks about politics. He has given you an analysis, a way to look at the world and understand what's going on. Like, why would there be a move toward a one world currency or regional currencies. Why would that be? Well, that would be not for the sake of convenience or all that. We had convenience when we had a gold standard. That was convenient. This is convenience for the ruling class, because it means that it's harder for one national currency to outcompete another when there aren't any national currencies. There's one being inflated at a consistent rate throughout the whole zone. So you just look at the world totally differently just from that one chapter. But then finally, thinking of democracies as being like publicly owned governments helps to account for a lot of what goes on. Since the caretakers who watch over the government every 2, 4, or 6 years have no personal stake in it, it's not their private property, they don't care what condition it's in when they leave, because they're not leaving it to their son. What do they care if they rack up debts, or they have endless wars, or they do all kinds of preposterous things? The kinds of incentives they operate under are exactly the kind of incentives you have when you're driving a rental car. Now, it doesn't mean that you always go out and crash a rental car, but when was the last time you washed a rental car? When was the last time you got an oil change for a rental car? So you don't think of the long-term capital value of it. Same thing with a country. So these, to me, are very, very important insights. I'm going to adjust my mic so I can sit more comfortably. If I have 11 more of these, I got to sit comfortable.
Most important thing you learned from Thomas Sowell?
Okay. First of all, I think one of the most valuable Sowell books is not, there are some Sowell books that everybody sort of knows the titles of. But one of the forgotten Sowell books is his little book from the mid-1980s called Civil Rights, Rhetoric or Reality. And if you go to Amazon, you will actually see that I have a review of that book from many years ago that I'm very happy with and proud of. That book, what I love about it is that every single page is smashing some myth. And so, for example, people think, well, discrimination causes poverty, or the differences in income or educational outcomes or whatever between all kinds of groups, not just racial ones, are caused or explainable by discrimination. And he says that is just such an easy, convenient comic book style argument, but it just doesn't hold. When you hold all the different groups constant and you look at people in the same geographical area, you look at people in the same age range with the same level of work experience and on, then all these variations actually disappear, which is very interesting. Or if you see, some people will say, oh, there must be discrimination because white PhDs earn more than black PhDs. He says, well, let's disaggregate the data and see what do they have the PhDs in? Because it turns out that Asian PhDs out-earn white PhDs because they have PhDs generally in things like engineering, whereas at least half of black PhDs are in education. And we all know that education is not a highly remunerative field. So in other words, he would look at the conventional wisdom, but under the microscope of data. He would look at these big aggregates and he would say the answer to whether this is true or not comes from breaking it down and disaggregating it. So things like that. But what I also learned, frankly, was a moral lesson, and that is about his courage in doing and saying the things he did, because it meant academic isolation, it meant being called names. But honestly, what is impressive about him is that none of that seemed to matter. Honestly, you would see him on television and he just would be like a hot knife through butter, and he didn't care what you said.
Could you briefly explain the difference between the constrained and unconstrained worldview? Is that
yes,
that possible?
This is in his book, A Conflict of Visions, and the unconstrained vision is a way of looking at the world. Is because I guess what he was trying to explain, although I don't think he quite put it this way, is why is it that people who think the economy can be planned and who think the minimum wage should be X dollars an hour, and who think we should be locked in our homes because of COVID, and who like all these sorts of disparate different things all seem to reside in the same mind. And people who disagree all have, it's very rare for people to have one of those opinions and not every single one of the others. Now, why should that be? And what he decided was there are two primary visions that people might have of the world. The unconstrained vision is one in which, and I don't mean to caricature it, but if we can think it, we can create it. If we can dream it, it can be made to happen. That there's no sense of the tragic fallen aspect of human nature, that we can remake ourselves if we need to create the world that we want. We can use our brains to plan and create an economy of abundance and so on and on. Whereas the constrained vision is more pessimistic about what can be accomplished through reason and through planning and through human effort. That in fact, it's actually not possible to plan an economy for a variety of reasons. And our temptation is to think that because I plan my life, I can plan an economy. But these are entirely different. So he's saying that the constrained vision is one that understands that human nature is what it is and isn't going to be changed. And so we shouldn't try totalitarian programs to change it in order to bring about our amazing vision of what the world could be, because what instead we'll wind up doing is creating some horrific totalitarian nightmare and not exactly have a wonderful society to show for it. We'll break a lot of eggs, but we'll never get the omelet.
How about Lysander Spooner?
All right, Lysander Spooner, a number of things from Spooner. I mean, the primary one most people get has to do with the Constitution. I found his work on the unconstitutionality of slavery to be very interesting, because whether or not I'm convinced by it, I thought his argumentation was interesting. His point was, and this was a line of argument that was picked up by Frederick Douglass, by the way. It was a minority line of argument among abolitionists. Most of them, like William Lloyd Garrison, said the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, and that's why it's a covenant with hell and we should burn it in public. But Spooner wasn't so sure. He said, well, let's look at the different parts of the Constitution that are alleged to involve slavery. He says, now, in no case is the word slavery used. And in each case, I can come up with a benign interpretation of what it means. So why should we be compelled to accept a pro-slavery, anti-freedom interpretation unless the text absolutely demands it? I don't care about the intentions of the people who wrote it. I can't be bound by the intentions of people behind some closed doors. The only thing that is relevant to us are the words themselves. And the words do not compel us to a pro-slavery conclusion. And therefore, because slavery is such an offense against natural law, we should never assume slavery. We should always assume not slavery. And since we can come up with an anti-slavery interpretation of these words, then we should do so. So, I mean, that's at least an interesting way to approach the question. Now, the other main thing has to do with the Constitution and whether constitutions truly bind us. And now, interestingly, Spooner does not think it's anti-libertarian to vote. He actually addresses the argument that if you vote, then you're giving your consent to the system. That's not his view. If you vote, you're trying to use a defense mechanism that you've been given to try to make your life better. In the same way that if you were in prison and you got to vote on whether you ate slop or prime rib, and you voted for prime rib, it's not because you consent to the prison system, it's that you want to make your life materially better. And if you abstain from voting, maybe you're going to wind up eating slop. How's that an improvement? So, but his key thing was, I never consented to this document. And there's no other aspect of life. Like when you buy a house, you've got to sign, like you have a special day, the closing day, where you go in and you just spend an hour signing documents. He says, now that's just to buy a house. This is an arrangement where we can conscript you, we can grab your money, we can tell you what to do, we can lock you in a cage if you make us unhappy, and I don't sign anything? Sorry, I don't buy that.
Ludwig von Mises.
All right, now Mises, I think his primary contributions really are economic, whereas with Rothbard, it's economics and a number of other fields. Now, Mises certainly contributed to other fields, but his real contributions were economics. Well, again, in his case, certainly moral courage. He comes from Austria in 1940 with a sort of a working knowledge of English, but it's definitely not his first language. He doesn't typically write in English, but he did write Human Action in English with the help of Henry Hazlitt, smoothing out his German style of English, which you can still see bits and pieces of. He has some kind of complicated sentences. And of course, in German, the word order doesn't matter quite as much. So you're guided by the different forms of the verbs and the nouns and stuff to figure out what's really going on in the sentence. But anyway, I happen to like Mises' prose. So the fact that he stood up against the spirit of his age and against the totalitarians, the Nazis who were taking over in Central and Eastern Europe at that time, and then came to the US and stood up to the academics in the US who were all falling in love with Marxism and partial Marxism, and he just wouldn't have any of it. And today, when we look back on New York University, nobody knows who was teaching in the economics department at NYU in 1961. Name me somebody. But we know the name Ludwig von Mises because his work is still discussed and still considered important. With Mises, of course, there are many things that you would say that you walked away with from it. But certainly his theory of the business cycle is very relevant to us today, that when you interfere with market interest rates, you set in motion a series of events that can't be unwound until the economy has come undone and needs to be redone in a sustainable fashion in the way it would have been done without artificially low interest rates. So the idea that we can fiddle with prices like the price of milk, well, most people recognize that that's going to lead to problems, that the price of milk is not arbitrary. But when it's interest rates, everybody thinks this is the key to permanent prosperity. But can it be really? Manipulating a rate lower than it was set by the decisions of millions of people. I mean, really, like that's how you have to. So then we shouldn't have any more foreign aid. Just tell Bangladesh, lower your interest rates if there are no real consequences of that. We, just instinctively, we know this is preposterous. And Mises walks us through step by step exactly why it is so. So that's one of many, many economic contributions from Mises.
Michael Huemer.
Okay, well, I love Michael Huemer, and I highly recommend people read his book, The Problem of Political Authority. And I would say that book rivals The Economics and Ethics of Private Property in sounding like a boring book. But it is anything but. It is a rollicking demolition of argument after argument for the state, for democracy as being the most moral system. And what Huemer is good at is, instead of abstract theorizing, most of the time his arguments are made through really, really vivid analogies. And so a very, very simple analogy drawn from the book involves you and your friends going out after class and having a drink. And your friends all vote that you're going to pay for the drinks. Does that mean you're obligated to pay for the drinks? Well, of course not. I don't value any of your stupid opinions at all. How should you get to, why would you get to vote on who has to pay? And it happens to be me. So he says, well, how is this different? Is there some magic dust that's sprinkled on people when there's a whole lot of them? And, and one of them happens to be like a political leader and people have voted for him. So once they vote for him, there's a magic dust that means that if he issues a command, you're obligated to comply. What is the source of political obligation? He wants to know. And he says, basically what he's saying is, every time we take the arguments for political obligation, well, we all consented to this, or, well, most of us consented to this, and it's impractical for us all to consent, so you just got to do what you're told. He says, there's no way we would accept this in any other area of our lives, not in the bar, not anywhere else. So why suddenly do we have to accept it here? And it's basically, the answer usually is a lot of hemming and hawing. And now, sorry, as a rigorous philosopher, I don't accept hemming and hawing as an argument. So highly, highly recommended book.
John Hasnas.
John Hasnas. I got to meet him once, years and years ago. 1992, I met him at an event put on by the Institute for Humane Studies. And he's, I think he's still a law professor at Georgetown. But he's written a lot of things. But the article that has stuck out all these years later and is still compelling is The Myth of the Rule of Law. And very early on in the Tom Woods Show, I did an episode of my podcast with him on this. Who knows what number it is? Maybe some followers of mine are like the Star Trek convention people, like they've memorized all the episode numbers. But if you look up Hasnas at tomspodcast.com and do a search and page, you'll find it. And his argument was, with The Myth of the Rule of Law, that people are just naive about the state, even so-called small government conservatives, or maybe especially those people, because they think there's an objective way to interpret those words on a page. And if we just get judges who will do that, then we'll be set. And so he gave us a thought experiment in the classroom. He said, all right, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law, and he goes on and on respecting the freedom of speech and all that. And then he listed a bunch of things that the government might do. And he says, can the government, according to this, can the government do this? Can it do this? Can it do this? Can it do this? And of course, we all said, no, 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 no. The First Amendment prohibits all that. And then he went and reviewed it with us. He said, okay, well, for number one, those of you who said no treated Congress as if it said the president. So you got that wrong. Then he just listed, he said, basically, all of you inserted your own wishful thinking into these words, instead of actually looking at the words on the page. And so he pursues this argument further and actually has you convinced by the end that there is no way to come up with words that that some judge couldn't figure out some way to interpret in a way that gets him the outcome he wants. And it's a terrifying conclusion, really, because it forces you into, let's say, a political posture you weren't expecting to adopt when you started reading his article.
Michael Malice.
Oh, geez. I've learned a lot from Michael Malice on a personal level. Sometimes what not to do, I'll grant you. But I've definitely learned a lot from him in life lessons, because he's helped me through a lot of some difficult times in my life. But also what I like about him is that he finds, he doesn't say that evil isn't evil, but he finds silver linings that I don't see sometimes. So sometimes I'll say, look at this terrible thing the regime is doing, or look at this awful speech this Politico just gave. But then he'll say, no, I don't know, listen to that speech again. Does that sound like the speech of somebody who feels really in control of things? Who feels like society is going just the way they want? Oh, yeah, I hadn't quite looked at it that way. But he often does look at it that way. And he's currently at work on a book to be called The White Pill. And he's going back and looking at, among other things, the terrors, the horrors of communism. And those were overcome. Those actually were overcome in our lifetimes. We saw people rising up against them. It's very, very easy, especially in our present times, to grow discouraged. But it's important to remember, even now, even with the censorship and the BS we have to put up with, even now, we're vastly better off than we were with 3 television channels. If there were 3 television channels, no one would know about the Tom Woods Show. There couldn't be a Tom Woods Show. There couldn't be this conversation. So it is important, much as we have to emphasize the suffering that we're enduring and the injustices of it all, at the same time, for the sake of perspective, it is important to realize the advances that we've made, because we have made them, and those can save us from debilitating discouragement.
Scott Horton.
Scott Horton. First of all, he's taught me what one person's brain is capable of holding, right? Just when you think, no, there's got to be a finite amount. Once you learn enough things, other things must get pushed out or something. No, apparently not, because Scott just knows it and knows it and knows it. But this is a guy who, for years and years, I think now Scott is really getting recognition that he deserves. Noam Chomsky recently twice praised Scott's book, Fool's Errand. Or it may also, Fool's Errand, the book on Afghanistan. And that's great. He got a copy, Scott sent it to him, and he actually read it. And he holds it in very high regard. And that's great. And now Scott goes to conferences and he walks out there and he gets huge cheers from everybody. But he labored for years in relative obscurity. Not that many people knew who he was, but he just did his interviews, he did his shows, he learned and learned and learned and became the unbelievable expert he is today. And not because he majored in Middle Eastern studies in college. I don't know if Scott went to college, to be honest with you. I just know that he reads everything he can. He listens to a wide variety of voices, and he has an amazing ability to synthesize all this. But in terms of what I've learned academically, it is primarily the counterproductive nature of almost everything the US government does in foreign policy, particularly the war on terror. And then on a smaller scale, I know I can ask him, well, did the surge work? If not, what was the problem with the surge? And I can get the answer from him anytime I want to right away.
Adam Smith.
Adam Smith did teach me a bit about the division of labor, although he was teaching the division of labor in terms of in one firm. You know, somebody does this part, somebody does that part, and if everybody does one little part, we get more done in the same amount of time. But the real interesting thing about the division of labor is the division of labor across the whole society. But that's still something. But mainly what Smith taught me was that society or commerce are self-regulating in the sense that we don't need to say we have a major pencil shortage, so we're going to need more firms producing pencils. We don't need to send that message to anybody because they'll get the message when they see that the price of pencils just tripled. And so somebody will think, whoa, now that price is high enough that I should consider going into pencil creation. And so what will happen then is that there'll be a greater supply of pencils now, and that'll put downward pressure on the price of pencils until those abnormal profits are dissipated, and then we move on. Or if suddenly people decide they want to use ballpoint pens from now on, they don't like pencils. So now you can barely sell pencils at all. You got to sell them at a very low price, and that leads to losses in pencil firms. So again, we don't need to send out a memo. We have too many pencil firms now. They figure that out on their own better than and sooner than and more efficiently than any politician could. And so this then can lead us to further insights of our own, like when there is a shortage caused by a natural disaster, a shortage of lumber. Well, what's that going to mean? It's going to mean that if lumber's price is allowed to rise sufficiently high, then people will build rafts from across from another island and row over there to bring them lumber if they have to at that price. Or somebody will say, I'm willing to give up my weekend where I look forward to having a beer and watching the game. I'm going to give up my weekend to drive 2 states away to bring lumber because the price is so high. But if you just force the price down, you're interfering in this natural process that Smith identified. And so instead, all that's going to mean is that lumber will be snatched up immediately, not used for its most value productive use. While a lot of people are going without lumber, that's not the right solution. So these subsidiary insights come from Smith's insight.
Ralph Raico.
I miss Ralph Raico so much. He was a historian at Buffalo State College, senior fellow of the Mises Institute. And he wrote a couple of books before he died. One of them was Great Wars and Great Leaders, and the other one I'm sorry is escaping me, but it was really a compilation of his lengthy articles on a variety of topics, from Woodrow Wilson to German liberalism and a lot of topics that he was knowledgeable about. But I really learned an awful lot about what I know about World War I and U.S. intervention directly from hearing Raico discuss the absurdity of it. So that'd be the first thing. I also learned about the scholarship and debate around the Industrial Revolution and whether or not that on net benefited the average person. So for a while, there was a debate that was called the standard of living debate, and it was divided into 2 camps. One was called the optimists and one the pessimists, and you can sort of figure out which was which. But as time went on, by the 1970s, the optimists had more or less won the debate, because even a Marxist like E.P. Thompson was forced to admit that, well, nobody says everything got worse. But they were saying that before. It wasn't nobody. They were saying everything got worse. So it was people like T.S. Ashton and R.H. Maxwell and others, and then later lesser-known scholars like Sudha Shenoy of, I can't remember if she was from New Zealand or Australia, who wrote a lot about it. And then, of course, Deirdre McCloskey has written about this too, that we see that, in fact, whether we look at living space per capita, clothing, caloric intake, life expectancy, income, whatever, we see that actually the standard of living was improved, and would have been improved further in Britain if it hadn't coincided with a lot of warfare that Britain was involved in the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars.
Historian Paul Johnson.
All right, now Paul Johnson is not a quote-unquote professional historian, so other historians hate him. The same way they hated David McCullough, who wrote a biography of John Adams and a number of other books, 1776. And that's mostly just professional jealousy, because most professional historians write excruciatingly boring books that even their peers only pretend to read. So the fact that McCullough gets rich as a historian or Johnson gets rich, they can't stand it. But also Johnson was extremely prolific. I mean, he wrote a history of the American people that I'm only so-so on. I really like I like his book Intellectuals. I like his book Modern Times, which is like a history of the 20th century. But past that, he was also, it turns out, a tremendous art aficionado. So he wrote a huge book called A History of Art, spanning art all around the world. Turns out that was just one of his hobbies, so he decided to write a majestic book about that. He wrote A History of Christianity, which I think he wrote in his more left-wing years, so I don't necessarily recommend it. He wrote A History of the Jews, extremely prolific. And I was told as a college freshman by another freshman that I should read Johnson's book, Modern Times. And I see, when you're a Harvard freshman, people tell you to read 800-page books or whatever it was, and they expect you to actually do it. And I did it. And I loved every minute of it because he writes in a crisp and engaging style where there are curious and interesting anecdotes on every page and quotations you've never heard before, or interesting tangents he'll go on about some invention and why it mattered. And there was nobody like him, really. And Modern Times taught me that the people I had been taught were great presidents were actually bad, and the supposedly bad presidents were oftentimes not so bad. So that was a key insight. But beyond that, I learned a lot about the history of Africa in the 20th century and the socialist experiments that occurred in Africa when Western educated African leaders returned to Africa and imposed on their poor people the stupid ideas they got in the West, but that there were some exceptions where they didn't impose outright socialism and they wound up doing a lot better. So I learned really about the dangers of collectivism as illustrated by the atrocities of the 20th century and the failed socialist experiments of the 20th century.
Murray Rothbard.
Oh, come on. All right. How many more do I have after Murray Rothbard so I can pace this?
No, we got about 5 more.
Oh, geez.
I think I lied about the 12. I apologize.
All right. Well, I learned so much from Rothbard. I really don't know where to start. His work on the Great Depression convinced me that it was the Fed's intervention in the 1920s that led to the crack up in 1929. I learned that Herbert Hoover was an interventionist, which is what the historians now admit, but it took them long enough to catch up to Rothbard. But I also learned the basic contours of Austrian economics by studying the concepts in Man, Economy, and State. That was of great importance to me. And I understood better where Mises was coming from by reading Rothbard's scholarly articles on epistemology and economics. But I learned about the history of economic thought by reading his 2 volumes on it. I learned about the period of pseudo-anarchy in the history of early colonial Pennsylvania that I hadn't known about, but that is worth knowing, that when the British representatives showed up, they got to whatever the hall was that the politicos were supposed to meet in, and it was all dusty with papers everywhere. No sign of anyone having been there in the longest time. You know, there's just little things like that I enjoyed learning from him. But I also learned about people who, before the Cold War got into really high gear in the 1950s, were warning that that was a bad idea, that communism was terrible, but converting your country into a gigantic warfare state might be a mistake. And it might be a mistake you never, ever get to take back. And we're living through that right now. We have a military that just keeps going around looking for enemies, that it's a program in search of justification. Well, I think that maybe we should have learned a lesson from all that. But, you know, I learned about some of the ideological movements of the 1960s, which Rothbard latched onto, searching for anti-war people. But also the implications of the non-aggression principle are spelled out in great detail, not always in ways I agree with, but always in ways that make me think. In his book, The Ethics of Liberty, I learned about money and banking from Rothbard, and where money comes from and what the purpose it's supposed to serve, and what's an example of a good money and transitioning back to a good money, and all sorts of things like that. I remember asking him in person one time, is there a history of money written from a pro-gold standard perspective? And he said, well, you might look at the Minority Report of the U.S. Gold Commission, because it has a couple of lengthy chapters on the history. And sure enough, it's a book. The Cato Institute published it in the early 80s called The Case for Gold. So it's actually written in the form of a book. And sure enough, the historical material in there is tremendously good. I found out only after Rothbard's death that he wrote those chapters, but he didn't tell me that. He could easily have said, I wrote the chapters on economic history in that report, but he didn't say a word about that. He just let me read it without realizing it was his thing. So he also taught me humility, I guess.
Frederic Bastiat.
Bastiat lived up until the mid-19th century and was an economic journalist, but was also an excellent economist in his own right, is not given proper credit for that. But he is the first person who taught me the principle of the unseen, that in economics, it's not sufficient to look at something solely with your physical eyes. You also need to look at it with your mind's eye. Because, for example, if the government builds some big project and then says, hey, everybody, look at this big project, and you should congratulate us for this big project, that's what you see with your physical eyes. But surely the labor and the resources and the time to create this thing would have gone into something else, the satisfaction of other needs. But I can't see those because they weren't allowed to come into existence. So we have to evaluate it in terms of the opportunities foregone. So, for example, in the 19th century, suppose somebody wanted to develop the iPod. Well, obviously, none of the relevant technology exists. So they would have had to engage in absolutely impoverishing levels of expenditure to do the research and develop the technology at that time to create an iPod. It would not even remotely be worth it. But suppose they did, and they said, hey, everybody, look at this iPod. You wouldn't have had that if you'd waited for your stupid free market to develop it. But the thing is, if we'd waited for the stupid free market to develop it, it wouldn't have had to come at such a huge expense to our standard of living. The market will develop it when we're ready, when we're willing to save the resources necessary for the R&D and for everything else, when we're willing to engage in the voluntary saving that lowers interest rates and tells entrepreneurs now's the time to borrow and to invest in these long-term projects. That's when we'll get it. So sometimes people say, look, the government invented this technology. We would never have had that. Well, probably we would have, because we're not stupid. We would have developed these things. There is a controversy about so-called crossover technology. When the government creates something, you think, well, would we have had Tang if it weren't for astronauts? Well, there's a lot of research on this, but some research says maybe 95% of this stuff would have been developed privately anyway, and the other 5%, who even knows if we need it or not. So Bastiat is constantly reminding us that we have to evaluate these sorts of things in terms of the opportunity cost and the importance of opportunity cost in economics.
Pat Buchanan.
All right, Pat Buchanan. First of all, I learned the value of somebody who, even though he gets criticized, oh, you wrote this column in 1977, he doesn't just get on his knees and beg forgiveness. He doesn't care what you think. He doesn't care that he wrote an unfashionable column in 1977 because he's too busy writing his columns in 2021. And he's too busy churning out best-selling books in those years. So one of the things I learned from him, and certainly his book, A Republic, Not an Empire, I thought was very valuable as a history book. I think he's very, very knowledgeable as a historian. So I would say that I learned some stuff about interventionism and from Pat. Also, when in 1991, the Persian Gulf War occurred, Pat was against that. And at the time, I didn't understand why, because I thought Well, we're right-wingers, we're Republicans, so we support the military. And right now, the military is involved in this war. I couldn't understand why he was against it, but he was teaching me something at that point. It's not war per se, or the military per se that we support. In his case, it was we had to stop the threat of communism. It's not because just whatever the Pentagon tells me, I just endorse it. And so that paved the way for me to think in healthier ways about war and the military. But the key thing he taught me had nothing to do with history or politics. I had dinner with him one time back in around 2005, I guess. And my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, had just come out. And initially, right-wingers really liked it, and it sold really well. But then the neocons discovered it. They didn't like it at all because it was not a neocon telling of American history. And Pat told me these people basically just endorse the New York Times version of American history. You know, that's just the way they are. So they're not going to like your book. But I told him they are attacking me viciously and unfairly. And, you know, what am I going to do? And his answer was, where there is no solution, there is no problem. Like, there's nothing you can do about that. They're going to write what they're going to write. So you don't really have a problem because there is no solution to it. If you have a problem, you sit there and think about how am I going to fix it? You can't fix it. So what was his advice? Just keep working your tail off. You know, just basically do what Pat does. Just keep churning out best-selling books, get your revenge that way. And that's what I did. I wrote articles, I made videos, I wrote books, and people just kept on discovering me. They discovered me through video platforms or through events or through word of mouth or through my books and articles. And now I've gotten to a point where I can actually make a living as a podcaster. I mean, this is like, if that's not a unicorn, I don't know what is.
Lew Rockwell.
All right, Lew's analysis of the world really, really helped shape my own, because a lot of times there would be something going on in the world and I didn't know quite what to think about it, and I would always want to get Lew's take on it. And I remember there was some, now you'll have to forgive me, the details are murky, and this could have been 20 years ago, but there was some episode where, I don't know if it was a US plane passing through Chinese airspace or some kind of thing like that, and the Chinese were vigorously objecting to it, and American patriots were all upset, and Lew had the gall to write an article called "China Was Right." And from that moment on, I realized this guy just doesn't care. He just is fearless. Or sometimes the right wing would say things like, we need to rein in the powers of the presidency. Well, there's no chance of that happening. There's absolutely no chance. If that was going to happen, it would have happened by now. So Lew instead would write an article called "Down with the Presidency." Like, let's hope Bill Clinton is the last president of the United States. Well, he didn't get that particular wish, but his willingness to think the unthinkable and say the unsayable and take our analysis all the way, even if it took him to radical conclusions, has been a really important guide for me.
Henry Hazlitt.
All right, Hazlitt is going to take that idea of Bastiat, of the seen and the unseen, and really develop it into a whole approach to economics. Because Hazlitt, who I know for a fact did not attend college, wrote Economics in One Lesson. It has sold a couple million copies. Any book on economics that sells a couple million copies and isn't a textbook that the kids are forced to buy must be impressive. And really, he is riffing on what Bastiat was saying. So if Hazlitt's going to talk about rent control, he's not going to leave it at, yep, rent control means people have lower rents. So look at these people. They have lower rents. I see that with my physical eyes. Well, again, anybody on any IQ level can see that with their physical eyes. What are the things that we're not seeing? So his point was, don't focus exclusively on what the immediate consequences of a policy are on the intended recipients. Focus on the long-term effects on everybody. So it's true that some people living in those apartments now get cheaper frozen rents. That's true. But so do you really think that's it? That all we have to do, it's like passing a law against gravity. You really think that's going to work? What is this going to mean? Well, think of it this way. I like Walter Block's view of this. Now, he's not actually advocating this. He's just using it as a thought experiment. But he says, just to show how wrong-headed rent control is, consider this. It would actually be better if what you were seeking was an increased supply of low-income housing. It would be better for you to impose price controls on literally every single thing in the economy except low-income housing. Because at that point, all the investment dollars would flood into low-income housing, and the supply would explode, and that would push the rents down. And that would get you exactly what you want. So when you realize that, then you realize, okay, well, then any measure that's not that is going to have some problem that we're not going to want. And so the rent control, of course, is going to send people far away from low-income housing. Why would they do that? First of all, low-income housing is not a lot of fun. Okay, it's not a lot of fun trying to collect money in low-income housing buildings. Okay, it's not something people are particularly excited about to begin with. And then they get the idea that the rents they charge could be arbitrarily changed. Forget it. They're not going to bother doing it. Or they'll do it, but they're not going to fix your leaky pipe, or they'll wait 6 months to fix it, because with the rent this low, they have 1 million people waiting outside to get that room from you who won't complain about the leaky faucet and the leaky pipe. So they'll just go there. Whereas if you have low rents because there's an abundant supply, the landlord doesn't have 1 billion people waiting outside the door, beating down his door. So he can be abusive and neglectful. So there are 1 million negative consequences that come from this. There would be fewer housing units available, but the problem would be very few people can see with their mind's eye. So very few people will say, the reason I'm having trouble finding housing is that rent control is making it unprofitable to build these houses. Instead, they'll look for help from the government, which is exactly the source of the problem. They'll blame the rich fat cats for X, Y, and Z. It gets people thinking in a completely poisoned way.
Dave Smith.
All right, Dave Smith is somebody I have thoroughly enjoyed watching grow into the superstar he is. And I would say that from time to time, so I listen to Dave's podcast somewhat regularly, and I find that his analogies and explanations are really, really good, and they can help anybody understand. And sometimes he'll be somebody like Lew Rockwell, where I say, wonder what Dave's take on this is going to be. And almost always I say, yeah, all he did was take libertarian theory and apply this thing to it. And he's fearless when it comes to debating people. He'll debate you. He'll have a good back and forth, but also I frankly think it's admirable that he'll talk to Ben Burgess, who's a socialist, and tell him, I think that your book has certain merits. There are very few people who will reciprocate. There are not very many left-wingers who will have me on and say, hey, that's a super book you wrote. So I think that's a great example for us. But the power of communication, effective communication, is illustrated very, very strongly through Dave. And I think that's why he's built up such a big audience.
Finally, Ron Paul.
Well, with Ron Paul, it's the value of sticking to your guns and being consistent, because it makes you credible. Because you hold this opinion in good times and bad. You know, on Twitter, sometimes I'll see people who don't know anything about me or anything about my friends say, well, what were you saying when Trump was bombing Syria? I was saying the same thing, of course. Why would I say anything different? I'm not like you. I mean, the sort of people who would ask me that are the sort of people who, yeah, under Trump, they're really upset, and under Biden, they're making excuses. So they assume I'm the same way. It's projection. They assume I'm the same way. But unlike them, I have principles. Well, Ron Paul has principles like times a million. And he doesn't care if he gets invited to the fancy events, whatever. There was a time in Bill Clinton's term where he was invited. They had a big thing at the Clinton White House. And they had this big receiving line where all the congressmen could get their pictures taken with Bill Clinton. And he and his wife just wandered around because they had absolutely no interest in that. That is not why he's here. I'm not here for celebrity. I'm not here to rub elbows. I'm not here to say, look at the cool people I hang around with. I have really urgently important ideas I want to convey to the public. And he just stuck to that, which is why you can listen to him in 1983 and he sounds like him in 2021. So all that's valuable. But also I did read some of his early books, So I actually did read the Case for Gold, the whole thing, the history and the economics and the case that he made. I read his speeches, and boy, that filled in a lot of gaps for me in terms of foreign policy and the neocons and all that. He's really got their number, and I definitely benefited from reading him.
We got about 5 minutes left. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. How can an understanding of Austrian economics help historians understand what happened and why?
Well, I actually wrote, maybe you're even referring to an article of mine. I wrote an article for the Journal of, the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics called What Austrian Economics Can Teach Historians. So you can Google that, or let's say use your favorite search engine these days, and you'll find what Austrian economics can teach historians. So I would say that the quick version would be, I can give a specific example of the kind of thing we can learn, that if we're looking at an economic downturn, well, we're going to be inclined to look for, was there monetary inflation that preceded it? Because we have a theoretical understanding of where these downturns come from. So we're going to know where to look. We're going to know what to look for. If you don't have any theoretical underpinning, how would you know what to look for? Are you just going to just repeat some events that occurred? Okay, but how do you know that any of those events had anything to do with what happened? There's nothing, strictly speaking, in the historical data that's going to help you resolve that unless you have some understanding of how things work. So, and most historians don't have that. So the Austrian school will help you with that. So I gave that as an example, like a specific thing. Because you are in the Austrian school, you know this sort of thing. But beyond that, the Austrians, well, let me say this. I can also understand why a minimum wage policy had a certain effect, but the analysis of the minimum wage is not unique to the Austrian school. That would just be because I have economic knowledge, I can know that such and such thing will succeed or fail, or I can evaluate the claims being made by the politicians at the time. Like, for example, there are numerous times in American history where politicians have claimed that money is too scarce. We need more money created. We don't have enough money. Well, I know right away they're just confused, because any amount of money can facilitate any number of transactions as long as the prices are free to fluctuate. So I can immediately know that's just demagogues, because I understand how money works. So I can evaluate what they're saying. Or if somebody says, we cut off trade with the world and that helped make us rich. Well, again, I can evaluate that, because, well, wait a minute, cutting off trade with the world, that's something that the enemy does to you during war. If that made you rich, why would the enemy blockade you? If that makes you rich because now you'll buy American or whatever, why would we have blockades? The blockades are meant to impoverish you, right? So the same thing they use to impoverish you is probably not going to make your country wealthy. So you become cynical about the speeches and pretty words of politicians because you have the understanding of how the world works that you can set against what they're saying and draw your own conclusion.
What is the most underappreciated contribution of the Catholic Church to Western civilization?
Oh, geez. All right, well, this is just for people who might not know, this is a reference to my book, How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, and it's organized in a series of chapters. So I'll talk about science. Science is the longest chapter because everybody thinks, well, the church hated science because they just want people to be stupid and ignorant, to keep putting the money in the collection plate and all that. I know that. And that was the conventional wisdom through the Enlightenment. That was why Voltaire was so unhappy, at least one reason. Then it was the conventional wisdom up through the late 19th century, when the president of Cornell wrote a 2-volume history on the alleged warfare between science and theology. That was Andrew Dixon White, Cornell. That was the conventional wisdom. That's not the conventional wisdom anymore. As of the 1950s, real historians of science do not believe that anymore. And if you don't believe me, there's a company called The Great Courses, and they sell courses taught by some of the top professors. Now, they are as plain vanilla as can be because they don't want to offend anybody. And because they're not libertarian, they're not conservative, they're not liberal, they just want to sell courses. So I took their history of science course just because I needed to see what is the guy saying. And sure enough, even there, when they're being as vanilla and inoffensive as possible, even they are saying, yeah, we've long since moved this past the simplistic, the church hated science sort of thing, that we don't buy into that anymore. It's a much more interesting and complicated story. And I tell that in my book. So I guess I'll just stop there. But the book talks about international law, which, by the way, international law does not have to mean the United Nations. It simply has to mean an understanding that there are certain general principles that apply not just to your enemy, but to you too. That all peoples, in order to be moral, have to subject themselves to. Things like that. Also, our current understanding of charity, that you, when you help somebody, you help them without expectation of reciprocity. Or you make a donation, you don't necessarily do it to get your name on the building. This would have been thought of as unthinkable and inexplicable in ancient Greece or Rome. So there are a lot of things that we just are not aware of that we've inherited, whether we like it or not, from the church.
Thank you to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Dr. Woods, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Keith.